Thank you. Good morning. In 1966, in Visions of Johanna, which you know, I'm sure, Bob Dylan sang, "Inside the museums, infinity goes up on trial." What did he mean by this? Was he questioning the status of the masterpiece and the fixity of the canon, suggesting that infinity has to prove itself again and again through art? Or was he singing about the inevitable decay over time and the fears of institutional oblivion, even the death of the museum? Today, in the 21st century, the pavements of European cities crack from the sheer volume of caged collections placed for posterity in darkened, inaccessible crypts. In this purgatory of archival safeholding, suspended from sight, thousands and thousands of artifacts and artworks are held at bay, caught in the limbo of Eurocentric conservation policies, regardless of their physical quality, quantity, or duplicate status. In Brussels, where I work with Canal Centre Pompidou, I'm developing what I call a metabolic museum university, which will open in November 2026 when the building is completed. I like to think that I have the best of both worlds. A future museum in the making and a metropolitan landscape filled with dormant collections. Some of these reference past industries or mechanization no longer in use. Others reference superseded experiments in natural science, anthropology, medicine. Others contain paintings that appear dated or in bad taste. And some are so covered with asbestos and arsenic that they can best be described as total museological apocalypse. Too expensive to clean or restore and unable to be deaccessioned for fear of fracturing institutional histories, they are left to sleep through time on site, even if they belong elsewhere. And if you allow me, I'd like to mention the European Museum that never ceases to haunt me, although in a way what I shall say applies to all stagnant collections. The museum, with no way to heal or rectify the foundations of its establishment, is the ethnographic museum. Like bailiffs, museum anthropologists assisted by colonial administrators assiduously removed every material expression of technology, religion, ecology, and aesthetics that they could physically transport back to Europe. With scientific pretensions, they ravaged homes, places of work, and sites of worship in attempts to comprehend, simulate, and thereby govern the other, instauring a prolific extractivist geography of trade. This museum without redemption performs the ultimate crime in the courtroom of Bob Dylan's infinity. For today, these testimonials of lives once lived constitute the epitome of museological gluttony. With their volume and value for future generations, they represent the elephant in the room, the largest blind spot in progressive curating and advanced art. No one speaks about them. Because sending back a few bronzes from time to time in acts of short-lived political proxyism can never account for the unquestioned closure surrounding rights of access to these collections today while they remain in Europe. So in this moment of collective quarter-life crisis with growing political unease and economic anxiety, state-run federal and municipal museums face censorship, financial starvation, even shuttering. So To what should we, and I'm speaking as a European here, so to what should we turn for hope? What divinatory model can help to remediate the fallout of collection kleptomania during colonialism? Should we be more strategic and upcycle secondary collections? Now, this may sound crazy and unmanageable, but it could help to restore the civic responsibility of the museum, gently steering it away from exhibitionary vanitas, consumerism, and visitor control toward the unbridled democratic intellect. Contrast to its sister institutions, the university and the art academy, the museum asks for no entry exam from its visitors, no proof of literacy from its students, and no peer group review from its visiting professors. Okay, so now I'm going to take you on a short walk through the future museum university, offering you a rendering built from my words and your mind's eye. Please imagine a room in the wing of a museum. There's a large table that takes up most of the space. You'll for sure, not because you are tired, but because the environment encourages you to look at art in a horizontal, seated position. The artist Lubena Himid did this recently for her show at the Flag Foundation in New York. Exhibiting large canvases of people in conversation around a table, she placed an actual table in the room so that the public could enter the paintings at the same eye level as her protagonists and use the furniture to hold their own meetings. So from the moment you enter the museum university, you have your own metabolic chair with a work table, a light, and a small projector should you wish to beam your own images onto the exhibition wall and spam the hang. The exhibition has been transformed into a study room, and rather like a library, you can spend hours here observing, reading, writing, with no one pushing you to move on, as is the case in museums today. A season ticket, membership, and time slots ensure that the atmosphere remains calm and conducive to inquiry and reflection. At the center of the room is this large table I mentioned earlier. Its curved shape emulates the bronze cast of a sheep's liver discovered in the Italian city of Piacenza at the end of the 19th century. This Etruscan sculpture of an animal organ dates to the 2nd century BC, and its divisions and inscriptions mirror the cosmos of the time with 16 astrological houses. In haruspicy, or the science of divination, the liver was dissected, observed, and encoded in response to a particular dilemma. It was, in Ernst Cassirer's words, an organ of thought, symbol-rich and forward-guiding in moments of chaos and incertitude. With its staggered surface, our liver-shaped table appears nearly topographic, like a map of hills, valleys, and plateaus in a landscape of second sight. Placed on differing levels, we perceive 30 or so objects of diverse size, shape, material, and origin. There are fish and insect traps, stuffed owls, hand grenades formed from bread tarnished with shoe polish, an 18th century condom made from goat skin with an erotic engraving, 19th century bedroom paintings too damaged to repair, and psychological tests from the 1950s designed to trap the mind. All of these belong to museum collections in Brussels, ranging from the medical to industrial, fashion to natural history, art to military and colonial. Identified by the curators of each respective museum, they signify metaphorical and technological embodiments of the word trap. Over the last year, I've asked 15 museums in Brussels to define the term trap through their secondary collections. And the conversations are remarkably stimulating. For example, the director of the Museum of Medicine, a venue attached to a functioning hospital, understood trap as trepanation, the delusional surgical operation performed in the 15th century and later on human skulls to extract the stone of madness. At the Royal Museum of Natural Science, the scientist curator became animated when I mentioned traps. There's a lobby, he said, to prevent artificial intelligence from being implemented in museums. And he signaled a current return to the analog materiality of 19th century holdings. If AI is a trap, he claimed, then a reappraisal of the collections is no guarantee for the real. He mentioned taxidermy and the somewhat comedic practice of slicing together different animals to produce a chimera, rather like artist Thomas Grünfeld's Misfits from the late 1980s. But beyond faking morphologies, the greatest trap in a collection, he insisted, was semantic and juridical. For what, I might ask you, is taxonomic authority, if not the persuasive trope of a con artist out to sell a new scheme? So with the riddle of the trap, I moved on to lure, trompe-l'œil, decoy, dupe, pun and travesty. I saw snares, shackles, fetters and nets, and was told of colored balls for children to play with that were camouflaged explosives. From paradox to propaganda, counterfeit to bootleg, dead end to booby trap, the traps in museums. They were sprung, laden, and ambiguous like ready-mades. Enchanting like a striptease, they could transport the intelligence of poised violence. And lethal parody, like a jack-in-the-box or a vacant obstacle controlled by a trickster, a charlatan, a mystagogue, or a dream catcher. Leurre, ruse, fraude, cul-de-sac, colson, tentation, attrape-gogo, guet-apens, pense-bête, trébuchet, miroir d'alouette, feinte, écueil, et hors-champ, all traps. And yes, I thought of the heritage of Marcel Bruters, his interest in the insincere and deception as constituents of art, of Belgian surrealism and Paul Nouget's concept of disconcerting objects, and what traps might mean in the ungovernable context of Europe today. I realized I'd undertaken a form of fieldwork in the museum, like I did 40 years ago in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, when Michel Leiris, the poet and disillusioned anthropologist, was still alive. We'd meet in the totem bar of the museum and talk about eroticism as ideational foreplay that linked the methodology of the artist to that of the ethnographer. Artists are essential to the operations of the Museum University. Their feedback in these early stages now both informs and guides its development. With tongue-in-cheek intentionality, their artworks are positioned like decoys, adjacent to traps, and, to quote John Welchman, at the intersection of camouflage and identification, end of quote. In the Museum University, nothing can be observed in isolation or explained through a single narrative that might risk over-directing the visitor's own hermeneutic pathway. Instead, constellations of artifacts and artworks are there to multiply enigmas in this visually charged modus operandi. A conceptual trap, a sculpture by Andreas Sluminski, confronts the brutally chopped wooden colonial fetter from the Africa Museum in Tervuren. A blackened and etched rolling pin by Caspar Bosmans sits close to monumental cast hands from the Foundry and Museum of Work and Industry. Nearby is a plaster foot by Aline Bouvy, a spoon with a large hole by André Steinbach, and a spider catcher by Laurent Dupont. Often, these artworks are molds, prototypes, or tools made by the artist to test stages in production and think ahead of the final resolution. There is liminality and porosity to unfinished works when placed in dialogue with incongruent artifacts. This quasi-divinatory assemblage needs no thematic organizing principle for imaginative and semantic sparks to fly. So yes, perhaps there is something dreamlike and Elysian about the museum university, like an oracle or a chance meeting on a dissection table. Yet, this is neither a cabinet of curiosities nor a tabula rasa with an attempt to wash over the contentious acquisition histories of some of these artifacts and their institutions. It is about collective problem formation, secessionist marking up, and the trope of metalepsis. The late and much-loved anthropologist Paul Rabinow wrote about metalepsis very succinctly. Metalepsis, he said, takes up the past or an aspect of the past, or rather the enduring presence of something past, and makes it function within a different narratological milieu, thereby subordinating it to a different function and thus transforming it and making it present. End of quote. To support this process in the museum university, a swatch of contextual notes written by the museum curators provides the visitor with information on the provenance of each exhibit. However, meanings don't stop there. Instead, the doors of perception are left open to the eye's unregulated orbit. The public embarks on a vagabonding endeavor, poaching across fields and mixing references once fenced off into discrete sectors and areas of expertise. So, art history, anthropology, science, design. Henrike Naumann, an artist who works closely with collections, describes the effect of the museum university. I quote her. You enter a room filled with objects that you know or are very common, but then there's something not quite right. There are objects that may be recognized in a domestic setting, but become different in the museum. I want people, she says, to stumble into rooms, to fall on all fours, and then get back up again and figure out what the new condition may be. End of quote. A tripping occurs, and this curatorial syncopation offers each visitor the freedom to shape their own ecology of art and ideas, such that this notion of care is transported by their imaginary. Debating chambers are held for visitors to voice the cross-connections they can make between exhibits and dialogue with artists, writers, ecologists, and lawyers. So, to conclude, I believe that we can invent more dramatic formats of public engagement in the museum by strategically deploying the generative potential of secondary collections. However questionable their individual provenance may be, as in the case of the ethnographic collection, so-called, their physical existence is something we need to address and value as a source for emancipation. Located at the intersection of visual culture and higher education, the model of a museum university addresses the prevalent and ongoing archival drive, or turn, through an inclusive, dare I say, decolonial framework. And here, my own stance is apparent. As a white European curator and cultural historian, I shall indeed continue to push against what Wole Soyinka so brilliantly calls species narcissism, and fracture the compartmentalization established by colonial disciplines and their museums. And so I suggest we look at the museum as if it were metabolic, constituted by its architectural syntax, the corpus of its collections, and the living, moving, and attentive bodies of visitors and staff that inhabit it daily. Perhaps the time has come to subvert this highly dominant, standardized, global spatial matrix of the museum, with its allocation of commercial spaces, the cafes and the bookshops, its overpriced, unacceptable, unsustainable, and instead build functional equipment in the widest and most profound sense of the term for the reassessment of collections in dialogue with one another. And yes, get word out that visual education is possible in the museum, regardless of textual literacy, nationality, social, or economic status. Thank you.